This time I have a Sony STRVX750. This is an old vintage stereo receiver from the early 1980s. And this one here, the complaint on this is that some of the buttons aren't working properly. So more than likely it just needs to have the buttons cleaned up. But we're going to check this out, give it a once over, and make sure it's going to be around for many more years. Let's check it out. This time I have a Sony STRVX750, they call it the Audio Video Computer Control Center. And this one has a problem. Let's hook it up and see what the problem is. Love the speaker terminals on these, and look, it has a switch to select between 4 to 6 ohms or 8 to 16 ohms. It even has a proprietary plug to connect into the matching Sony tape deck, which had this funky 4-pin special connector to control the tape deck. Okay, I've got power to the unit. It has 2 power switches on here. It has a main power and a system power. Main power obviously turns the main power off, and then the system power turns it off but leaves it in standby. So the standby light will be on the front. It's interesting, when I push the system power button, I get a received light that blinks on the front, just like it's received a signal from the remote control. See? And when you push any buttons, do they do the same? I don't think they do. Just that one does. Let's see if we got sound on your speakers. Speakers on. 87.5 should be picking up my little test transmitter if it's actually sending out a signal. And it does. Complaint on this is the buttons aren't working properly. That one's working. What else might not be working on here? Tuning level, that works. AM or FM. Bass and treble are working. So the membrane keyboard is working. You can set two different memories. So if you like lots of bass and treble, you can set it to acoustic 1, for example. You recalled it. That button doesn't work. That might be part of the problem. Some of the buttons aren't working. Memory. That button's not working. Tape 2's not working. There, now it is. And here the problem on this is buttons. Muting button doesn't work. Okay, so we know what the problem is. It's going to be tactile buttons that need to be taken care of on this one. So let's pop it apart. Ooh, toasty. This cap's got quite the bulging top on it. I think it's just the way the cap is, though. This is a switching power supply, this unit. This was one of the first, what they call pulse power supply power units that Sony had. It's shielded in this box. It should say on the front pulse power supply on here too. Most of them did. This one doesn't say it, but it is a pulse power supply. Switching regulator here. So this is going to be the primary filter, I think. 1000 microfarad at 200 volts. And then these are the lower voltage ones, the 4700 at 63 volts for the positive and negative rails for the output transistors, which are down here. It's got a tuner block in it here. I remember the first one of these I worked on. This is one of the very first switch power supplies I ever worked on. scared the living daylights out of me when I got into it. That was back when I worked for Sony. I actually had to work on one of these things, and I'd never seen a switch power supply before. This one has had the thermal cutout removed. Normally on these units there was a thermal cutout. Actually it's 145 degrees Celsius one. You can tell because the sticker down there says so. But there normally was a thermal cutout that was strapped across the top of this big resistor, and it had a liberal amount of thermal compound placed over top of it. Its job was, if this resistor got up to 145 degrees Celsius, the thermal cutout would open and it would shut the unit down. Now, many shops, including the one that I worked at, they just took that crap out because the guy that did the audio stuff, he got tired of replacing them all the time, because in the summer when the unit was running, especially if someone had it in a cabinet, they would always overheat and pop that fuse. I know this unit's been modded because somebody's put an external ground wire in to ground the front board, which was a common failure on here. Someone's actually put a piece of speaker wire in here to ground it. That could have been done at the shop that I worked at. I didn't do the audio stuff. I had an audio guy, so this would have been worked on by old Marv, either Marv or Clive. They did the audio stuff. The only stuff that I did at the shop was VCRs, TVs, and camcorders. That was all I did. I would help out on audio if the guys got stumped, but typically I didn't touch any audio stuff. But I'm sure this probably came from the shop that I worked at, and it probably was serviced there. And I know the guy that brought it to me, so I've known him for 40 years. Anyway, yeah, that's I'm not really too worried about that. This is a system that was used in his garage, and it was brought to me because the volume buttons weren't working properly. So that's what I'm going to address, is the volume buttons. I'm not too worried about anything else, because I don't think he wants to put much money into a garage stereo, even though this was quite a nice old unit. So I'll pull the front panel off to access the membrane key switch and the tactile switches, and we'll take it from there. Unplug the front panel. Remove these screws that hold the board in place. These ones do have a battery in them to maintain the radio station memory. I'm sure it's long gone, but again, not a big deal. That's something that could be replaced if it was required. It might even still have a charge in it if it's been plugged in all this time. But likely it's dead because, well, this unit is at least 40 years old. At least. I think it's more than that. It's probably more like about 43 years old. I think these were out around 1981, 82, somewhere in there. I worked for Sony in 82, 83. That's when I worked for Sony. And they were around then because I got thrown to the wolves with one of these units, as I was mentioning before. And I'd never seen a pulse power supply, as Sony called them before. Of course, we call them switch mode power supplies, but Sony had their own name for it. They called it a pulse power supply. In fact, in the service manual it just said, do not service, replace this as an entire block. I might even say it on the box itself. At least the earlier ones did. This is not the first model that used this. There were other ones that also used the same power block. Now, I got all the screws here to lift this out. Let me just lift out. You see on here we've got a whole bunch of tactile switches. Even these ones on the front that look to be membrane switches actually just pushed on a little push rod here. Everyone thinks it's a membrane key switch, but it wasn't. It's actually just a little push rod that actually activated a regular style tactile switch. And the ones he's complaining about on here are the volume buttons. Volume and mute. Yeah, I can operate this with the board removed and the front panel removed, just to see which buttons are not functioning properly. Mute button doesn't work for sure. Gotta fix that. Volume down does if you press it a little bit harder. So these two here should take a look at those. Mute for sure. It doesn't do anything. The other buttons seem to work. Memo for the memory for the like I've got the tone controls. I got my two tone settings in here. Flat button doesn't work. No, it does. The memo button is kind of sticky. You got to really kind of push on it. So there's a few buttons on here that probably need a cleaning. But these ones here, the tops should lift off these quite easy. And if I don't lose the pieces in the process, I should be able to fix the contact. These switches are pretty simple inside. They're just a little diaphragm, little metal diaphragm that pushes down onto a couple contacts. And what happens is, well, they get dirty. The little contacts inside here, as you can see, are no longer nice and shiny, especially the ones on the edges here. So basically what we need to do is we need to give these a little bit of cleaner. Clean these up a bit, and then that will generally fix them. And from the look of some of these switches, it looks like they've been taken apart and fixed before, because the little plastic tabs have been remelted. If you look at this one here, you see? That one's been done before, as has that one. These buttons are actually working, but this one's not. So we're going to address the problem with that one. Looks like these ones have been done too. You see? These probably were done at the shop that I worked at. Marvin was pretty good at that. He would take these switches apart and give them all a little drop of cleaner and clean them up and put them back together. Because even back in the day, back in the 80s, someone would come in with a receiver like this with switches that weren't functioning, and they would say, I want it fixed. I don't want to spend more than $50 to fix it. And they're still like that today. Someone will say, I want to fix this, but I don't want to spend more than $50. So you can't start ordering switches and start changing switches at a couple dollars a piece if you've got a cap of $50 or $60 total to repair things. You got to get ingenious and fix them. And these were fixed before, and look at how long they lasted till now. I'm just going to get some cleaner onto a Q-tip, and we'll just clean out the contacts inside here. And do the same for the little button that pushes down. The side that makes contact with the switch. Okay. Now if I put this back in here, we'll put the button back together. There we go. Alright, put the button back in. And I'll see whether the mute button works now when I power it up. Now the mute works. See? It drops it by 20 dB. And the volume buttons work fine. So this was the one that was a problem, and it is now fixed. So now I can put the rest of the switch back together. Just going to heat up the soldering iron. We'll try to melt the little tabs over again to hold the cap back on place, which is what was done before on it many years ago. Just give my soldering iron a chance to warm up here. Okay, that button's now fixed. Get the front panel, put the front panel back on. That was the only one that was really acting up, and that's the one that he complained about. And that's the one that got fixed. I tell you, it takes a lot longer to fix things when you're constantly being interrupted, having to monitor tapes that are being recorded. I really need to have a monitor in here so that I can see what's going on in the other room. I keep having to check it, and right now I'm just doing some beta tapes, and they weren't all recorded at the same speed. Well, like there's segments of the tape, some that are recorded at the beta 2 speed, others at the beta 3, and I have to adjust the tracking every time they change speeds while they were making their recording, you know, back in the early 1980s when most of these recordings were done. So it makes it a challenge when I have to go back and rewind the tape back and find where the speed changed and start over again and pick up. It's really something that I gotta basically babysit, but the problem is we're talking a tape that's 3 hours long, and I don't necessarily want to just sit there for 3 hours and watch it, so I kind of check it every couple minutes. That way if something went bad, I usually check it about every 5 minutes while I'm doing something else. That way if something goes bad, I can correct it and pick up again and no one will know. Just got to get this circuit board centered and pop back in place, and then we can try this out. Got to get these buttons here have to all poke through the appropriate points on the chassis, on the front panel. Alright, now I can throw these screws back in and we can test. Yes, I did notice this top that's popping up. I don't think this is actually the capacitor that's bulging. I think what's happened on this is that the shrink wrap just over the years has become tighter and it's pushing the dome up. But this is a filter for the primary anyway. I don't think I've ever changed one. I'm not going to start changing it now because that capacitor would be relatively expensive just due to the size of it and the capacity and the voltage. That would be a rather pricey capacitor. Center this button. Here we go. Get the top, or get the front back in place so I can throw a few screws in it. I'll just throw one in for now, just for testing, just to hold the front on. Alright, so volume down, volume up, muting. That was the one that was, the complaint was the muting button. He uses this in the garage. So it's basically just playing the radio. Make sure that everything else works on her tuner. And we'll just check all the buttons. 1, 2, 3. All the buttons are lighting up here. So they're all working. Tuning up, tuning down. FM mode. Yep. Tuning level high and low. Now check this out. How often have you turned your stereo off, right? Whoops, wrong button. I went to turn off the standby, but it's okay. Same thing. How often have you turned off your stereo with the volume, with the volume blasting, right? So you turn your stereo on and you get blasted out of the room because you've got it up full blast, or wherever you had it. That wasn't an issue on these units because, as you just heard, they actually ramp the volume up. It starts out at minimum, and it actually even shows up on the vacuum fluorescent display here, if we can see it. You can see where the volume is right now. It's at quite a high level. If I turn it off and I turn it back on, you'll see that the volume actually will start to gradually increase on its own. I thought that was quite a nice touch on a unit like this. This was, at the time, this is probably one of Sony's higher end receivers of the day, right? The STRVX750. It supported both moving coil and moving magnet cartridge. I don't know whether he's using it as a turntable or not. I believe it's just being used as a radio. Again, it was brought to me just to have the volume. Oh, it was in muting mode. Alright, I wonder why it wasn't as loud when it was cranked up like that. But it remembers what mode it's in too. So if muting is off and I turn it on, it'll go up to the volume it was set to. If I have muting on, it should return to the muting level that it was set to before. Right, I can turn it off and it'll jump up. It remembers what state the volume was in. There's only one more thing I'm going to do on this before I send it out, and that's just because it's good housekeeping on this. I'm going to pull the bottom off it and just make sure that none of the regulators and stuff are showing any indication that the connections are getting weak. That probably was taken care of back when this thing was serviced. Well, it was at least 20 years ago, because the shop shut down the service department shortly after I left. I think they shut their service department down in around 2005 or so, because they couldn't get anybody that would work there. The owner tried to replace me when I left, but he was such a miserable SOB that nobody would work for him. So the service department did not stay open. It shut down a few years after I left. But this would have been serviced long before that. I bet you this was serviced back in the 90s, maybe, the last time it was serviced. And cleaning those switches like that and melting the plastic tabs was pretty common in the industry, especially at the place that I worked at, just because the owner had such low go-ahead limits. No one wanted to phone and say, oh, your unit's going to cost X number of dollars to fix. And you see this? A fuse has been replaced on the bottom. Someone put a fuse in on the bottom here. Pigtail fuse, looks like, but that's okay. I'm just more or less interested in what the connections on some of these regulators look like. But it's interesting to see. That looks like Marvin's work. That's something that he would have done. Soldered a couple pins onto a fuse and stuck it in the bottom. Guess there was a fuse in there at one point. It was a thermal fuse. It's a thermal fuse and it's been replaced by a regular fuse. That's something that Marv used to do all the time. I'm just looking at the connections here. Looks like the common ones have already been taken care of. Regulators here have been redone. That one there probably could be redone. That resistor there looks bad. It's a big resistor. Same with these ones. I'm going to redo these ones just because I'm in here and I don't want it necessarily coming back. So we'll deal with this. It's unplugged now, for you guys wondering. These big resistors, they get warm and have a tendency to dry out the solder. I used to hate audio back when I worked in the biz. All the portable stuff and all the audio stuff went to the junior guys because, well, there was, say, most of this stuff had a $50 maximum bill. 49 bucks was the average repair charge on these things. And I was going where the money was, which was TV. So I didn't do much in the way of audio for the 20 years I was running the service department at the local shop that I worked at, which is, it's long gone now. The place was called Jack's Radio and TV, and they've been shut down for they shut down in 2013 or 2012, either 2012 or 2013. I forget what year they actually shut the business down, but I was there from '83 to 2003. And they were a big shop. They were an independent shop, but they were the largest independent Sony retailer in Western Canada. Non-chain, right? Independent, with a single shop. We had to compete with the future shops and the Best Buys and the A&B Sound and stuff, but they weren't measured the same way that the independents were. We were the largest independent dealer with the highest grossing sales in Western Canada. And because of that, we serviced a lot of stuff, because a lot of stuff broke down. So we ended up having to service a lot of it, and it kept, well, there was a point there where there was 4 of us working in the shop. There was 4 techs. Myself on video recorders and TVs in the shop and cameras, and then we had audio guy Marv. We had another guy that did a bit of TV and audio, and then another guy that just went out on house calls, and then so there was 4 of us. And the guy would go out on house calls, and if he couldn't fix it in the house, then he would bring it in, and it would go to me. And basically, he was just a tube jockey back in the days when there were still TVs with tubes in them. He'd go out and just swap tubes. There was a number of techs that worked in there over the years, and a lot of them quit and went on to better things or retired. The guy that would have worked on this, he retired, and then once he retired, then I had to fill in because he was the last guy before me to go. Everybody else had got fed up with the owner and his temper. Let's put it that way. And they all flew the coop. And they left me to fend for myself for the last year. And then I got fed up and I flew the coop. Okay, I think this is probably okay. We'll throw the bottom back on here now. I love these old units that had these quick release screws. You didn't even have to take the screws out, just loosen them off. And the bottom dropped off. Then Yamaha went and screwed it up for everybody by putting on bases that didn't remove. And then once Yamaha got away with that and nobody complained too loudly that you couldn't remove the bottom to service it well, then it was open season. It became cheaper to not put a bottom cover on and make the machines that much more difficult and expensive to repair. And then people, of course, once they were faced with bigger repair bills for disassembly, they started tossing stuff out. So it was the end of an era. Servicing was on its way out and not coming back. Even the outputs on this, if we look at the outputs are separately mounted to the heatsink, but they're connected by wires, so you can actually remove the transistors and work on them. Although they're hard to get at because of other things in the way. You actually remove the heatsink. You pull out a couple screws and lift the heatsink up, and then you can access the transistors. But these ones here, unless you really try hard, it's really quite difficult to blow these up because they had pretty good they had pretty good protection. So whatever where my sound was, it was between tracks. Plug it in and say, what? Not working? No, it was the MP3 player was between tracks. Here's the radio. Okay, this is done. Thanks for watching. We'll catch you in the next one. Bye.